Close your eyes and picture ancient Rome. You are probably seeing white marble, clean columns, quiet temples, calm men in togas walking across an empty square under a soft sun. Hold that image, because almost everything about it is wrong. The real Rome would have hit you like a wall, the noise first, then the smell, then the sheer impossible density of more than 1 million human beings packed into a few square miles, 2,000 years before any other city on Earth would manage the same. This is what it actually looked like, and sounded like, and smelled like to stand in the greatest city of the ancient world. Let us start with the marble, because that is the biggest lie of all. The temples and monuments of Rome were not white, they were painted. Brilliant, almost violent color, covering nearly every surface. Statues had skin tones, painted eyes, red lips, gilded hair. Temple columns were picked out in crimson and ochre and deep blue. The famous white marble we admire in museums today is simply what survived after the paint weathered away over 1,000 years. To a Roman, our idea of their city would look bleached, drained, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Now, widen the view. Rome was the first true megacity in human history, more than 1 million people. To put that in perspective, no other city would reach 1 million inhabitants again until London, more than 1,700 years later. Rome did it with no electricity, no engines, no modern plumbing in most homes. And almost all of those people did not live in villas. They lived stacked on top of one another, in apartment blocks. These blocks were called insulae, and they defined the real skyline of Rome. Not temples. Apartment buildings, 6, 7, sometimes more stories high, crammed wall to wall across the valleys of the city. The ground floor held shops. Above that, the wealthier tenants. And the higher you climbed those dark, narrow staircases, the poorer and more dangerous it became. The top floors were cramped wooden fire traps with no running water, no toilet, and no escape if the building came down, which they regularly did. Rome's apartment blocks collapsed and burned so often that emperors had to pass laws limiting how high you could build.
Step down into the street and the city closes in around you. Most of Rome's streets were astonishingly narrow, often barely wide enough for 2 loaded people to pass. The towering insulae on either side blocked out the sun, so even at midday the side streets were in shadow, lit in slabs of hard light where the sun broke through. There was no zoning, no logic, no grid in the old heart of the city. Just a tangled organic maze that had grown over 700 years. And it was alive. Every ground floor was a shop or a workshop, open straight onto the street. Bakers, butchers, fullers treading cloth in vats of urine, blacksmiths, wine cellars. Fast food was everywhere. The Roman street was lined with thermopolia, counter-service food bars with great clay jars set into stone counters, selling hot stew, bread, cheese, and watered wine to a population whose tiny apartments mostly had no kitchen. Most Romans, rich and poor, ate out, on the street, every single day. The walls themselves talked. Romans wrote on everything. Election slogans, advertisements, prices, insults, love notes, crude jokes, all scratched and painted across the plaster in red and black. A Roman street was not a quiet place of contemplation. It was a roaring, crowded commercial corridor, closer to a modern bazaar in Cairo or Delhi than to the silent ruins we imagine. And the noise never stopped. By day the streets belonged to people, because wheeled carts were banned during daylight hours. The congestion was simply too severe. So instead, all the deliveries, all the supplies for 1 million mouths, moved at night. After dark, Rome filled with the grind of cartwheels on stone, the shouts of drivers, the crack of whips. The poet Juvenal complained that it was impossible to sleep in Rome, that the traffic of the carts in the narrow, winding streets was enough to wake the dead. The city that never slept is not a modern invention. It was Rome. Now follow the crowd into the Forum, and here, finally, is the grandeur, though not the kind you pictured. The Roman Forum was the beating heart of the empire, a dense cluster of temples, basilicas, monuments, and open squares. But it was not serene. It was the busiest, loudest, most crowded place in the entire city. Law courts ran in the open air and in the great basilicas, with crowds gathering to watch trials like theater. Money changers worked the porticos. Politicians gave speeches from the rostra, a platform decorated with the bronze rams of captured enemy warships. Religious processions pushed through, and every temple blazed with color and gold leaf. The whole space a controlled riot of marble, bronze, paint, and bodies.
Rise above it all, and you would see the monuments that did deserve the legend. The Colosseum, holding 50,000 roaring spectators, its outer arches once filled with painted statues, its top ringed with a vast canvas awning rigged by sailors to shade the crowd. The Circus Maximus, a chariot racing stadium so enormous it could hold 250,000 people, more than any stadium standing on Earth today. When a race ran, the sound of that crowd rolled across the whole city like weather. And running into all of it, the water. This is where Rome's true genius showed. 11 great aqueducts carried hundreds of millions of liters of fresh water into the city every day, by gravity alone, across distances of up to 90 kilometers. That water fed hundreds of public fountains, where most Romans collected what they drank, and it fed the baths. The baths were the living room of the Roman world. Enormous, lavish complexes where, for a tiny coin, almost anyone could spend the afternoon soaking, exercising, gossiping, doing business, and being seen. The largest could hold thousands of bathers at once, under soaring painted ceilings. And who were the million people moving through all of this? Not the calm, identical men in white togas of the movies. Rome was the most crowded mixing pot the ancient world had ever seen, a city of the entire known world poured into a few square miles. You would have heard dozens of languages in a single street, Latin and Greek above all, but also the tongues of Syria, Egypt, Gaul, North Africa, and Spain. Merchants, soldiers, freed slaves, and embassies from the edges of the empire all pressed together in the same markets. And a vast share of the people around you, by many estimates 1/4 to 1/3 of the city, were enslaved, doing the cooking, the carrying, the building, the teaching, the dying that kept Rome standing. Forget the white toga, too. The toga was formal wear, hot and awkward, worn mostly by citizens for public occasions. The everyday city was a wash of color. Simple wool and linen tunics dyed in earthy reds, yellows, greens, and browns, women in long stolas of every shade, workers stripped to short, practical tunics, slaves in plain cloth. The Roman crowd was not a marble frieze. It was a loud, sweating, brightly dressed river of human beings of every origin, in constant motion from dawn. But for every wonder, there was a shadow, and the gap was staggering. On the Palatine Hill, the rich lived in sprawling painted mansions with private gardens, courtyards, and silence, looking down on the city literally and in every other way. The word palace comes from that hill. And just below, in the valley, lay the Subura, Rome's most notorious slum, a dense, sweltering, dangerous district where the poor were packed into the worst of the insulae. Crime, fire, disease, and the river's floods all fell hardest there. In Rome, immense wealth and brutal poverty did not live in separate cities. They lived one street apart, in full view of each other. Then the sun went down, and the city changed again. There were no streetlights. Once darkness fell, Rome became a black labyrinth, and respectable people simply did not go out without a train of torch-bearing slaves and guards. The same narrow streets that had been markets by day became genuinely dangerous after dark, the territory of thieves and gangs. Above, the apartment windows flickered with the small, dangerous light of oil lamps, the constant threat that would, again and again, set whole districts of the city ablaze. So put it all back together. Stand once more in the heart of ancient Rome, but see it now as it was. Color everywhere, painted gods staring down from every temple, apartment towers leaning over streets so narrow the sky is a thin, bright ribbon overhead. 1 million people shouting, selling, cooking, arguing, praying, packed shoulder to shoulder. The smell of bread and smoke and bodies and the river. The roar of a crowd from the Colosseum. Water running endlessly through hundreds of fountains. Wealth and filth pressed together in the same breath. It was not a quiet white museum. It was the loudest, most crowded, most colorful, most alive place that had ever existed. The first time humanity had ever tried to live 1 million at a time. And then it fell, and the paint washed away, and the towers crumbled, and over the centuries we slowly forgot, until all that was left was the clean white marble and the silence. That silence is the illusion. This, the noise and the color and the crowd, is what Rome really looked like. History unfolded.